It's a kind of an anticlimax, but be it as it may, the subject at hand is the WMD Free Zone Conference in the Middle East. I was asked two questions: what has been achieved and where is it going? Question mark. Now, Ambassador Shapiro has spoken at some length about the subject, and Dr. Oliver Meyer as well, and my colleague Meirav Tsafari as well. Emily had made also a long comment on that issue, and everything reminds me of the famous Karl Valentin, whom I think that Oliver is laughing because he probably knows it, a comedian and author of the Weimar Zeit, who died in the year that I was born, 1948, who said in such an instance that everything has been said already, but not yet by everyone. So I will contribute my modest share trying to minimize as possible the duplication that, but I can't escape it. So let me first turn to the first question: what has been achieved so far? And I will divided it, and I will start by trying to see what has been achieved between the end of the 2010 conference and the outgoing one, the 2015, without going into details about the language of the resolutions that have been passed, only to mention that at the 2010 conference, the conference has adopted an action plan where, among other things, they've also had one of the action items which called for the implementation of the 1995 resolution that all the previous speakers that have spoken about it have already mentioned, that with the mandating of a co-sponsor, convening a conference, and so on and so forth. We all know that the efforts to implement the resolution took a while before a facilitator, the Finnish Ambassador Lajava, was appointed, and his efforts notwithstanding, the three conveners felt obliged in November 2012 to issue separate statements postponing the conference. In other words, the attempt was failed. The spokesman of the Department of State, Victoria Nuland, in trying to sum up the US position, has said that in order to move forward, the states must engage each other to reach an agreement on the fundamental differences, and also explained that the present conditions in the Middle East were not conducive for trying to hold the conference. Unable to reach a consensus over that fact about the failure, the UK and Russia called separately for the conference to be held in 2013, and Russia was more specific by stating that the conference should convene no later than April of 2013. Egypt, as expected, accused Israel for the postponement, and following the postponement, the facilitator, as we have heard, called for multilateral consultations in order to prepare the ground for a future meeting. He continued his consultation, realizing the differences in getting the parties on board, especially Israel, based on the mandate of the 2010 resolution that he was confined to. And in order to get the process going, a couple of series of meetings took place with the aim of trying to find a common ground. I think that in the course of numerous consultations, Mr. Lajava realized the complexities and understood that in order to accommodate Israel's position, that is to say, in order for Israel to participate, and voice her concern. Her concerns, as a matter of fact, have to be taken on board, and that is within the mandate, a mission impossible, as we have seen. And here I fast forward to the 2015 conference, trying to preempt the criticism. The three conveners, this time the three together, have released a working paper detailing their version as to the efforts that were put since 2010 conference in order to convene the 2012 conference. It is quite interesting to note, in parentheses, that Russia has on the one hand signed up on that paper, but on the other hand had expressed its displeasure with respect to the circumstances under which the 2012 conference in Helsinki could not take place, and later also voiced criticism of the US and UK and Canada blocking the final draft of the 2015 conference. Here's a citation from the working paper describing the 5 meetings that took place in 2013-2015. I think that it's quite important to note their perception as to what has transpired over those 5 meetings. Quote, despite this effort, it was not possible to agree with states of the region the necessary agenda modalities for a conference to be held in 2012. Although states of the region continued to disagree on important elements of the agenda, there has been significant, I underline significant progress, the nature of which I don't know, but have my own doubts. This includes a broad acceptance of the majority of the agenda. Remains unknown what those items were, much of which is not contentious, also interesting. And also what they had to say, they spoke about the serious discussions of the modalities and outcome documents and the willingness of the parties for all conference decisions to be taken by consensus. That's also interesting in view of the Egyptians and Arab League final draft that didn't contain the consensus element. The paper makes a few recommendations which include urging all states of the region to support, supported by the facilitator and the conveners to undertake urgent consultations and so on and so forth, with the end on the basis of arrangements freely arrived at by states in the region. A very important statement that we should bear in mind apropos the upcoming difficulties at the 2015 conference. Egypt had a different perception of the exercise. In fact, not being served by the facilitator, it thanked him for his services and asked at the same time to fire him. Egypt, I think, has recognized that continuing the informal session that the continuing plays into the hands of Israel, and decided not to attend the 6th round of consultation, which in its words of its delegate at the 2015 conference regarded as a waste of time. Getting back to the time between the 2010 and 2015 conference, Israel's decision, and it was well pointed out yesterday, Israel's decision to engage, and I open brackets and ask myself whether that represents a strategic shift or a tactical one, question mark, close brackets, should be seen as a positive step. I would want to mention on this happy note that Emily and myself have advocated for Israel to take a proactive mode rather than the bunker mentality which has been representing Israel's position for many, many years. Engaging, we felt, means the ability to influence the process, and I'll get back to Israel when I speak about the conference. Summing up the phase between the two conferences, a mandate has not been fulfilled, facilitator realizing that it will not be possible to convene a conference adhering strictly to the mandate and then launched a process that parties participated. First and foremost, of course, I mentioned already Israel. Let me now turn to the conference, and without going into the if debate, namely, hadn't it been for the WFD free zone, the conference would have ended with an agreed upon agenda. Oliver has expanded. I and him take issue with Ambassador Shapira, who felt that hadn't it been for that, the US would have gone along with the text. I have my doubt, but really, I mean, it doesn't matter because it's water under the bridge. The fact of the matter was that the US, UK, and Canada have decided not to join the consensus. So the question is then, what went wrong? What is it in the Egyptian and Arab League calculation that led them to believe that the working paper that they have submitted and later the content of the final draft will be endorsed by, for our case, for the US first and foremost? Before trying to answer the question, I think that it's worthwhile to take a look at the draft of the Arab working paper. Oliver went into it, so I will not go into it, only to mention a quite constructive proposal within that working paper, and that is to establish two working groups which will be dealing with the scope, geographic demarcation, and the second one dealing with verification measures, all very important issues when the day come to be discussed at some length. I also don't have now to elaborate on the elements missing from the paper. Those who have been into it knows it very well. Not to mention that a few elements that were contained in the 2010 resolution, over which a consensus has been agreed, were also missing. Clearly, it was a working paper that should serve as a basis for discussion, but it also reflects a sense of anger. I will refer to the Arab and the Egyptian working paper. It also reflected a sense of anger and frustration as far as those groups are concerned. Israel, as we all have heard, decided to attend the conference as an observer for the first time after 20 years. As a follow-up to its participation at the Layava consultation, it also decided to circulate a paper to the NPT conference outlining its perspective, and Meirav went into some length and outlined the thrust of that paper. And finally, as we all have seen, that final document of the 2015 conference was blocked by the US, UK, and Canada. So what went wrong? If you believe the Russian delegate to the conference, and by the way, the Russian representation at the conference was relatively low level, Mr. Ulyanov, the representative, blamed the US, UK, and Canada for the demolition of the consensus, quote unquote. London and Washington, he said, had no right to insist on their veto powers after, I know, after the start worry letter follows. London and Washington had said he had no right to insist on their veto powers after the talks basically failed. Ulyanov suggested that London and Washington didn't like that the final document did not contain a veto power to each of the three powers, as if Russia didn't care much about it. On the whole, my impression is that the Russian interest in the WMD free zone is really quite minimal. They don't assign that much of importance, perhaps verbally, but otherwise haven't seen any serious Russian moves on that side. So a slightly different version, of course, to put it mildly, was mentioned by U.S. delegate Rose Gottemüller, and she made points why is it in the U.S. position, and I think that most of it I will also go along, that that conference could not take place. It's quite a detailed speech that she held on the very last day of the conference, and for those of you who are interested, you can go online and have a look. I don't have time to go into it. So in trying to answer the question what went wrong, it's clear what went wrong, as opposed to the last 2010, where Obama was willing to succumb to Egypt's pressure and surrender American position in order to get a final document, and that at the cost of a serious breach as far as the understanding with Israel was concerned. This time around, the final document was apparently not was undermining national position, and if the Russian delegate is right, also not giving up a principal tool, namely the ability to exercise its veto right. Has Egypt miscalculated this time, question mark? Was Egypt led to believe that the US will be willing to strike a deal the way it did in 2010? That, by the way, might have been the case if one can infer from a latest press report on the very last days, according to which some Israeli unnamed officials were concerned that a compromise at the cost of Israel might be in the offing. And as I said, has Egypt overplayed its card? And was or is Egypt really interested in implementing the resolution? Or is it in Egypt's interest to have a constant grievance that they can always play with in order to gain some international saliency? The latter is my feeling, and I will not go into it. Let me then speak clearly, shortly about losers and winners. Losers first. I think that the NPT regime as such can be seen as a loser with no final document. Was it, what does it do to the viability and credibility of the regime? Oliver has gone into it, and I will not go into it. Then I think that another loser clearly is Egypt, without going into too many details. For Egypt, the idea of the zone is only a means to an end, and the end is quite clear, and that is stripping Israel of its deterrence capability, or according to foreign press, its nuclear capability. And as to the winners, shortly, without going into details, clearly Israel could be seen as a winner. The same, I think, that the US-Israeli relations could be seen as a winner in view of the traumatic experience of 2010. And whether the US is a winner, I don't know. Certainly it's not a loser, but it's difficult to pass a judgment. Briefly, another page. Briefly, with free space. Where do we go from here? Difficult to say, and nevertheless, let me say the following. The issue won't go away. It is on the international agenda, and Egypt, at least, is determined, because of the reason that I've already outlined, to pursue the issue further. Since there is no agreed upon process due to the fact that there is no final document with an action plan to launch, a process similar to the one in 2010 won't happen, because there is no legal basis for action to implement the 95 resolution. That doesn't mean, however, that Egypt and like-minded states will not look for ways to leave the subject on the international agenda. One way, of course, is the usual one, is to pass yet another futile resolution at the UN. And if that happens, which I assume might be the case, then what? Will another resolution help realize the project? Given the ideological fundamental differences between Egypt and Israel on the issue, and I don't have time to go into those differences, and given the current situation in the region, the prospects for an Egyptian type of implementation is not given. And therefore, I have to once again to go back to another paper that Emily and myself written. We have said that against the backdrop of the turmoil in the region, I think that the parties have to change their mindset and introduce a new disc in order to take into account the entire environment, and then be a bit more realistic in trying to achieve the long-term ambitious goal. Thank you.
Thank you very much.